The cafeteria was loud with clinking trays and casual chatter, but my corner was always quiet. I unpacked my lunchbox carefully, the way my mother had taught me. Rice shaped into little triangles, vegetables cut into flowers, a slice of rolled omelette. It wasn't store-bought or plated on fine china. It was home. That's when I heard the laugh, sharp, deliberate. "Is that your lunch?" The chairman's son stood a few tables away, holding a tray piled high with expensive takeout. His voice carried, and heads began to turn. "Looks like something from a convenience store discount bin," he added, smirking. Heat rushed to my cheeks. I wanted to close the lid, hide it away, but my hands froze. "Do you really eat that every day?" "No wonder you." He didn't finish the sentence, but the mocking glances around me filled in the blanks. I kept my eyes on the food, trying to swallow the knot in my throat. My lunchbox, once comforting, now felt like a mark of shame. I wished I could vanish into the floor. Then, from across the cafeteria, I saw movement, a familiar figure cutting through the crowd. Conversations quieted as the CEO himself walked in, dressed sharp as always, scanning the room. His gaze landed on me, then flicked briefly to the chairman's son. Without a word, he crossed the distance and pulled out the chair beside mine. The room fell into stunned silence, and then in a voice calm enough to sting, he said, "That looks good. Mind if I have a bite?" The chairman's son's smirk faltered, confusion flickering across his face. A few people stifled gasps, while others leaned forward as if they'd just been handed front-row seats to the most unexpected scene of the year. My fingers trembled as I pushed the lunchbox slightly toward the CEO, unsure if this was a kindness or some elaborate joke I didn't understand. But he didn't hesitate. He picked up my chopsticks, lifted a piece of omelette, and tasted it like it was the most natural thing in the world. He chewed thoughtfully, then looked straight at me. "Perfect seasoning," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did you make this yourself?" My voice caught, but I managed a quiet yes. His lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then you should be running our catering department, not hiding in the corner." Laughter rippled through the room. But this time it wasn't at me. It was warm, approving, aimed at the absurdity of anyone mocking my food. The chairman's son shifted uncomfortably, pretending to check his phone. I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Why would the CEO of all people take my side so publicly? He set the chopsticks down, still looking at me. "People forget," he said softly, "that the value of something is in the care put into it, not its price tag." My chest tightened. For the first time since I started at the company, I didn't feel invisible. I felt defended. And not just in words, but in action. One simple bite that turned the whole room on its head. For a moment, the cafeteria seemed to exist in two different worlds. The one I had been living in, where every glance felt like a judgment, and the one the CEO had just created, where I was suddenly at the center without being the punchline. I tried to focus on my food, but my hands were still shaking, my appetite tangled with 100 questions. The chairman's son muttered something under his breath and moved to a table further away, his voice stripped of the loud confidence he'd had just minutes earlier. I didn't watch him leave. Instead, I kept my eyes on the CEO, who was now pouring tea from the little thermos I had packed for myself. "You bring tea too?" he asked, his tone light but genuine. "Yes, it's homemade," I answered, still unsure how to navigate this strange turn of events. He took a sip, nodded approvingly, and then set the cup back in front of me. "Eat," he said simply, as if it were an instruction and not a suggestion. I obeyed, and the awkward tension around us began to fade. Not completely, but enough for people to start returning to their own conversations. Still, I could feel the change in the air. I knew this wasn't going to erase all the quiet cruelties or sideways glances I'd endured, but it had left a mark. In one small, deliberate gesture, he had turned what was supposed to humiliate me into something unshakable, a moment I could stand on when the whispers came back. And deep down, I suspected he knew exactly what he was doing. The next day, the story had already spread through the building. I caught fragments of it whispered in hallways, retold in break rooms, exaggerated in ways only office gossip could manage. Some made it sound like the CEO had shared an entire meal with me. Others claimed he'd scolded the chairman's son in private. None of it was true, not entirely, but the part that mattered was he'd sat beside me. He'd asked for a bite. He'd stayed long enough for everyone to see it wasn't an accident. Now, every time I entered the cafeteria, conversations quieted. Some people offered polite smiles. Others quickly looked away, as if afraid to be caught staring. The chairman's son avoided me entirely, his once loud voice now fading to a low murmur when I was near. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or unsettled. In my department, colleagues were suddenly more eager to hear my ideas. They asked questions in meetings they used to breeze past, as if my opinions had gained new weight overnight. But with the attention came a subtle edge, a curiosity that wasn't always kind. "So, how long have you known him?" one coworker asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. I shook my head. "I don't. Not beyond work." She smiled thinly, clearly not believing me. And that was when I realized something important. While his gesture had protected me in the moment, it had also painted a target on my back. Whatever came next, I would have to stand my ground, not just with my lunchbox, but with everything I'd worked for. That afternoon, as I was leaving a budget review meeting, I found him standing by the window in the corridor outside. The city skyline stretched behind him, the glass reflecting streaks of late sunlight across his suit. He turned when he heard my footsteps. "How's the cafeteria today?" he asked, his tone almost teasing. I hesitated. Quieter, I admitted, but not exactly normal. He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "People talk," he said simply. "It's what they do when they can't control the narrative." I didn't know if he was trying to comfort me or prepare me for more whispers. "Why did you do it?" I asked finally. It wasn't just to taste my omelette. His mouth curved slightly, but his eyes stayed serious. "Because I've seen that look before," he said. "The one you had when he mocked you, like you wanted to disappear. I know what it's like to be cornered in front of a crowd." I studied him for a moment, trying to imagine a man like him, confident, untouchable, being on the receiving end of that feeling. "Did someone ever stand up for you?" I asked quietly. He paused, his gaze drifting to the skyline. "No, that's why I make sure to stand up for others." The sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt. For the first time since the cafeteria, I felt the knot in my chest loosen. Not because the building had changed, but because I realized I wasn't the only one carrying scars. We stood there in a silence that didn't feel awkward, just heavy with things unsaid. I wanted to thank him again, but thank you felt too small for what he'd done and for what it meant to me. Instead, I asked, "Do you know what they're saying now?" He smirked faintly. "Of course. I hear more than they think." I raised an eyebrow. "And you're not worried?" He shook his head, slipping his hands into his pockets. "People will always invent stories. It's easier than accepting the truth." I tilted my head. "And the truth is?" He looked at me then, his gaze steady, unwavering. "That you did nothing wrong, that you belong here, and that anyone who thinks otherwise is going to have to answer to me." My breath caught, not because of the words alone, but because of the quiet certainty with which he said them, like it was the simplest fact in the world. A passing group of employees slowed their steps when they saw us talking, their eyes curious. The CEO noticed but didn't move away. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, making it clear he wasn't hiding this conversation. I realized then that his defense in the cafeteria wasn't a one-time gesture. He was still standing beside me, even here, even now. And somehow, that felt more powerful than the moment itself. Because it wasn't about a lunchbox anymore. It was about the fact that someone, finally, wasn't afraid to be seen with me. The following week, a company-wide networking lunch was announced. An event I usually dreaded. It meant sitting at round tables with people who spoke in polished, practice tones, where every sentence felt like a test you could fail without realizing. I arrived early, choosing a seat at the far edge of the room. My lunchbox wasn't with me this time. Catering had been arranged, the kind with tiny portions on porcelain plates. I was quietly sipping water when I saw him enter. The room straightened itself instinctively, conversations softening, postures adjusting. He scanned the crowd, and for a moment, I thought he'd join the executive table at the front. Instead, his eyes landed on me, and without hesitation, he walked over. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, as if the entire room wasn't watching. I nodded, aware of every set of eyes that followed him to my table. A few seats away, the chairman's son froze mid-bite. The CEO set down his plate, glanced at me, and then began asking about my current project like it was the most important conversation in the building. My answers were short at first, cautious, but his questions were genuine, pulling me into a rhythm I forgot could exist in this environment. The murmurs started again, low, persistent, but different now. Not ridicule, speculation. And though part of me feared what stories would follow, another part didn't care. Because in that moment, I wasn't the girl hiding in the corner. I was the person the CEO had chosen to sit beside again. Halfway through the lunch, a few department heads approached our table, clearly trying to mask their curiosity with politeness. We were just discussing the new logistics proposal, one of them said, glancing at me like they weren't sure if I should be included. The CEO didn't miss it. "Good," he replied, "because she's the one you should be talking to about it." The shift in their expressions was almost comical. Surprise, then a quick recalibration into feigned enthusiasm. One of them asked me a question about supply chain efficiency, the kind I knew inside out but had never been given the floor to answer before. My voice was steady as I explained the data, layering facts with solutions I'd been refining for weeks. By the time I finished, their nods were genuine. The CEO didn't interrupt once. He simply leaned back, letting the silence after my words settle like a weight they couldn't ignore. I realized then that his presence wasn't just about defending me. It was about giving me space to prove myself without interference. Across the room, the chairman's son was watching, his expression unreadable, like he couldn't decide whether to be annoyed or impressed. The thought almost made me smile. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't speaking to convince people I belonged. I was speaking because I had something worth saying, and they knew it. The CEO caught my eye, gave the smallest nod, and in that moment, I understood. This was his way of saying, "Keep going." When the lunch ended, people lingered longer than usual. A few stopped by my table to thank me for my input or ask if I'd send over my notes. It was strange. Just weeks ago, those same faces barely noticed when I entered a room. Now, they looked at me differently, weighing not just who I was but what I could offer. As the crowd thinned, I stood to leave, gathering my things. That's when the CEO stepped in front of me, blocking my path, not in a commanding way, but in a way that felt deliberate. "Walk with me," he said, and it wasn't a request. We left the hall together, our steps echoing in the quieter corridor. "You handled that well," he remarked. "They were listening," I replied, still unsure how much of it was because of my words and how much was because of him. He stopped then, looking at me like he was choosing his next words carefully. "They were listening because you had something worth hearing. Don't forget that." My chest tightened, not from nerves this time, but from the way he said it, as if he'd been waiting for me to believe it myself. We reached the elevator, and when the doors opened, I caught a glimpse of the secretary inside. Her gaze flicked from me to him, but she didn't say a word. She simply stepped aside. As we entered, I realized this wasn't just about a seat in the cafeteria anymore. This was about reclaiming space everywhere. And maybe, just maybe, I was starting to own it. The next big challenge came faster than I expected. A high-stakes client meeting scheduled for Monday morning. Normally, I wouldn't have been in the room for something at this level, but on Friday afternoon, an email from the CEO's office appeared in my inbox, Be prepared to present the operations overview. My stomach flipped. It wasn't fear of the material, I knew it inside out, but fear of the audience. This meeting would be filled with people who had been in the industry longer than I'd been alive, including the chairman's son. All weekend, I refined my slides, rehearsed my points, and told myself I could do this. But by Monday morning, as I stood outside the conference room with my laptop, I could feel the weight of their eyes even before I entered. The CEO was already seated at the head of the table, his expression calm, unreadable. When he saw me, he didn't just nod, he gestured to the chair right beside him. It wasn't just an invitation, it was positioning. He wanted everyone to see exactly where I belonged. As I settled in, the chairman's son glanced at me, then at the CEO, his brow furrowing slightly. The air was tight with expectation. I opened my laptop, my hand steady despite the rush of adrenaline. And before the meeting began, the CEO leaned toward me, his voice low but firm. "Remember, it's your floor." My pulse steadied. This wasn't about proving myself to them anymore. It was about proving to myself that I'd already earned this place. The meeting began with formal greetings, the kind where every word was measured and every smile calculated. When the CEO introduced me as the person who would lead the operations overview, I saw the subtle flickers of surprise across the table. Raised brows, a quick glance between two directors, the faintest smirk from the chairman's son. I ignored it all. Standing, I connected my laptop to the screen, the first slide illuminating the room. My voice started low, but even, each point landing with precision. I didn't rush. I didn't overcompensate. I let the numbers speak for themselves, layering them with strategy, timelines, and projected outcomes. As I moved through the presentation, the expressions around the table began to shift. Less skepticism, more focus. Questions came, but they weren't traps. They were genuine, probing for details. I answered each one calmly, citing specifics without glancing at my notes. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the CEO watching me, not intervening once. He didn't need to. By the time I reached the final slide, the room was silent, not the cold, dismissive silence I'd felt before, but the kind that comes when people are processing something they didn't expect. "Any final thoughts?" I asked. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the senior partners leaned forward. "I think we've underestimated this plan," he admitted. The chairman's son looked down at his papers, avoiding my eyes entirely. I closed my laptop, my heartbeat steady. I had walked into this room with their doubt and walked out with their attention. As the meeting wrapped up, people began to file out, exchanging quick handshakes and murmured comments. A few stopped to tell me, "Good work," their tones more sincere than obligatory. I thanked them, but I didn't linger. I wanted to leave before the rush of post-meeting chatter turned my focus inward again. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt someone fall in step beside me. "You handled them well," the CEO said, his voice low enough that felt like it belonged only to us. I glanced at him, a small smile tugging at my lips. "They weren't as intimidating as I thought," I admitted. "Or maybe," he countered, "you were more prepared than they expected." We reached the elevator, and to my quiet satisfaction, the secretary was there again, this time holding the door open without a word. The memory of her blocking me flashed in my mind, but I pushed it aside. The CEO stood next to me as the doors slid shut, the faint hum of the elevator filling the space between us. "You've come a long way since that lunch," he said. I looked down at my hands, remembering the warmth of that simple gesture, him sitting beside me, asking for a bite. "Maybe," I said softly, "but some things haven't changed." He tilted his head. "Like what?" I met his eyes. "I still bring my own lunch." He laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded, and in that moment the air felt lighter. We were no longer just CEO and employee. We were two people who had chosen, in small and deliberate ways, to stand in each other's corner. A month later, the cafeteria looked different to me, not because the tables had changed or the menu had improved, but because I no longer walked embracing myself for whispers. I still carried my lunchbox, the same one that had once been mocked. But now it felt like a quiet badge of honor. That day, I chose a table near the window, sunlight spilling across the surface. I had just opened the lid when a shadow fell over me. "You're early," the CEO said, setting his tray down across from mine without waiting for an invitation. Conversations in the room dipped instantly, the familiar wave of curiosity spreading through the space. "I had a head start," I replied, smiling faintly. He eyed the lunchbox. "What's on the menu today?" I slid it toward him, and he didn't hesitate to take a bite, just like that first time. But this time, there was no tension in the air, only the hum of a shared routine. "Still perfect," he said. Across the room, I noticed the chairman's son entering, his gaze landing briefly on us before moving away. There was no smirk this time, no loud comment, just acknowledgement. I realized then that the real shift hadn't been in the way they saw me, but in the way I saw myself. I wasn't waiting for someone to validate my place anymore. I had claimed it, one bite, one meeting, one choice at a time. And as the CEO took another bite from my lunchbox, it felt less like a defense and more like a tradition, one neither of us planned to stop. We ate in a comfortable silence for a while, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Around us, the cafeteria slowly returned to its usual noise, but I noticed how people no longer stared for long. It wasn't because they had lost interest. It was because the novelty had worn off, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I sipped my tea, catching the CEO watching me with that same calm focus he always had when he was about to say something important. "You know," he began, "it was never about the food." I tilted my head, curious. "Then what was it about?" He set down his chopsticks and leaned back, slightly. "It was about making sure you were seen. That you knew you didn't have to shrink just because someone else tried to make you small." I felt a warmth spread through my chest, not just from his words, but from the realization of how far we'd come from that first awkward lunch. "You did more than that," I said quietly. "You reminded me that I had a choice to keep standing, even when it felt easier to sit down." He smiled then, faint but genuine. "You've been standing on your own for a while now. I just made sure the room noticed." I looked at him, realizing how rare it was to have someone use their position not to overshadow, but to amplify. And as I closed my lunchbox, I knew this wasn't just about gratitude anymore. It was about respect, mutual, steady, and unshakable. Later that week, the company hosted a small celebration for closing a major deal. It wasn't a grand event, just an after-hours gathering in the top-floor lounge, with champagne glasses and city lights spilling in through the tall windows. I almost didn't go. These spaces still carried ghosts of old insecurities. But when I stepped in, the CEO caught my eye from across the room and gave a subtle nod, the kind that said you belong here. I found a quiet corner with a plate of appetizers, observing the laughter and clinking glasses. That's when a junior employee I barely knew approached me, hesitating before speaking. I heard about the lunchbox story," she said almost sheepishly. "It made me bring my own food again. I'd stopped because people joked about it." Her words caught me off guard, and I felt something tighten in my throat. "I'm glad you did," I told her. "There's nothing wrong with carrying a piece of home with you." She smiled and walked away, and I realized this was bigger than me. The CEO joined me a moment later, offering a glass. "What's the toast for?" I asked. He looked out at the skyline. "For the things we choose to keep, even when the world tries to take them from us." We clinked glasses, the sound small but certain. And in that moment, I understood. The lunchbox, the meetings, the elevator, they were all chapters in the same story. One where I stopped waiting for permission to exist in a room and started taking my seat at the table.